All right, let's dive into a big one today. We're breaking down a Supreme Court case, United States versus Davis. In this case, it really grapples with this idea of what exactly is a crime of violence. How do we define that under federal law? And specifically, we're looking at a part of the law, 18 U.S.C. section 924C3, sometimes called the residual clause.
Yeah, so the big question in front of the court was, is this section of the law, is it so vague that it actually violates the Constitution? Like, does it go against the idea of due process? Is it unconstitutionally vague?
Okay, so that's what we're going to unpack. We're going to lay out the arguments, figure out what the court decided and how they got to that decision.
Let's get right to it. So in United States v. Davis, right, the Supreme Court agreed with the lower court.
Yeah.
And they said, yep, this residual clause, this part of 924C3, it's unconstitutionally vague.
Unconstitutionally vague. I think we need to back up for a sec. What exactly is this statute, this 924C? Break it down for us.
Sure. So this section of the U.S. Code, it basically defines what a crime of violence is. And that's important because it ties into another part of the law about using a gun during a crime. So 924C3 is laying the groundwork, giving us the definition for that firearm offense. Now, there are two parts to this definition. We've got subsection A, sometimes called the elements clause. And this one says a crime of violence is a felony that has, as part of its definition, the use of physical force, or the attempted use or the threatened use of physical force against another person or their property.
So, like, if the crime itself involves force, then obviously it's a crime of violence. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. But then we get to subsection B, and this is the one we're really digging into today, this residual clause. It says a crime of violence is a felony that by its nature has a substantial risk that physical force might be used while committing the offense.
Oh, okay. So instead of just using force being a part of the crime, this is about whether the crime itself, just by its nature, carries a risk of force happening at some point.
Right. And the argument here, the reason this residual clause is being challenged is because how do you really define what a substantial risk is or what the nature of an offense means in this context? It also feels a bit fuzzy,
Yeah, I see that. And this isn't the first time the court has dealt with this kind of vague language in the law. We've got this really important case from 2015, Johnson v. United States. What happened there and how does it connect to Davis?
Oh, Johnson is super important here. Back then, the court struck down a similar clause, the residual clause in the Armed Career Criminal Act, the ACCA. They said it was too vague. The ACCA defined a violent felony, similar to our case, as a felony involving conduct with a serious potential risk of physical injury. So different words, but the same basic idea, right? Defining crime based on how risky it is.
So this pattern, the court striking down these vague clauses, is that telling us something bigger?
I think so, yeah. It's a concern about fairness, making sure everyone understands what the law is and that it's applied consistently. It's a message to Congress, like, hey, you got to be more specific when you're defining these crimes.
Okay, so back to Johnson. What exactly made that ACCA clause so vague in the court's eyes, and how did that logic carry over to Davis?
So in Johnson, there were two main issues. First, the court was like, how do we picture the typical way this crime happens? Like, you can commit a crime in so many different ways. How do we decide what the usual risk is?
Right.
And second, there was no clear line, no specific level of risk that made it serious. It was all subjective, open to interpretation, which leads to inconsistent rulings, right?
And basically, the Davis court looked at 924 and saw those same problems all over again.
Right. Same exact issues. What is the nature of a crime? How do you measure that objectively? And how much risk is substantial enough? Those questions were just as tricky in Davis as they were in Clinton.
Didn't the government try to argue a different way of looking at this clause in Davis? Something about focusing on what the defendant actually did?
They did. The government pushed for this case-specific or conduct-specific approach. Their argument was, hey, let's look at what the defendant did in this specific case. Did their actions pose a substantial risk? But the court said, nope, not buying it.
Why not?
They pointed right to those words, by its nature. They said that phrase means you have to look at the crime itself, the bigger picture, not the details of how one person committed it.
Right. By its nature seems to be talking about the inherent characteristics of the crime, not just one instance of it.
Exactly. And the court was like, okay, even if we could twist the meaning of by its nature to fit what you're saying, why would Congress even use that phrase if they wanted to focus on specific actions? They could have written it way more clearly if that was the goal.
So, if they're not supposed to look at the specifics of the case, how should courts interpret 924 then?
Well, the court said the language calls for a categorical approach. Basically, you look at the core elements of the offense, how it's defined in the law, not the nitty-gritty details of what the defendant did. It's about the crime in its abstract form.
Okay, so like, instead of looking at whether this specific robber used a weapon, you look at whether robbery, as a crime, generally has the potential for weapons being used.
That's the idea. And the court pointed to the history of 924, the legislative history, to back this up. They highlighted a connection to a similar law, the Bail Reform Act, which has a similar by its nature phrase and has always been interpreted categorically. So the court's reasoning was, hey, Congress used similar language. They probably meant a similar approach.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but also the legal context, how these kinds of laws have been understood before. Now, what about this rule of lenity I keep hearing about? How does that come into play?
The rule of lenity is a big deal in criminal law. It basically says that if a law is ambiguous, if reasonable people could interpret it in multiple ways, then the benefit of the doubt goes to the defendant.
Makes sense.
And in Davis, the court said the vagueness of this residual clause, that's exactly the kind of ambiguity we're talking about. So lenity supports striking it down. The idea is if the law isn't clear about what's forbidden, then you shouldn't punish someone based on that unclear law.
It seems like a pretty strong majority opinion then, but there was a dissent, right? What was their take?
Yeah, Justice Kavanaugh, along with Justices Thomas and Alito, they dissented. Their main point was, hey, this substantial risk standard, it's all over criminal law, and juries, they can figure out if a crime generally poses that kind of risk. They also emphasized that Congress clearly wants to crack down on gun violence, and striking down this clause, they argued, would just make that harder.
So they thought the court was being too strict.
Right. And they even disagreed on the by its nature language. They said it actually refers to the defendant's actions and the circumstances of the crime. They thought a more specific fact-based approach was not only okay, but actually necessary to get at the kinds of dangerous crimes Congress was concerned about.
So a different view on how much weight to give to the specifics of the case versus the general nature of the crime. Okay, final question. What does this Davis ruling actually mean going forward? It sounds like it could shake things up a bit.
Absolutely. This opens the door for past convictions based on this now unconstitutional clause to be challenged. People who are found guilty of using a gun during a crime, where that crime was defined solely by this vague residual clause, they might have grounds to appeal.
So this isn't just an abstract legal debate, it has real-world consequences.
Oh yeah, big time. This could lead to a lot of new legal battles as these cases work their way through the courts. There's a lot of uncertainty about how this will impact the prison system and prosecutions going forward.
Okay, so now for our 10th chair perspective. Let's imagine you're the 10th justice on the Supreme Court. You've heard all the arguments, you've seen the precedents. Where do you land on Davis?
So I absolutely get the importance of stopping gun violence. That's clearly what Congress had in mind here. But at the end of the day, I have to side with the majority. Our Constitution demands clarity in our laws. People need to know what's off limits, what could land them in serious trouble. This residual clause, it relies on these vague standards, substantial risk, the nature of a crime. It's just not clear enough. It doesn't give people fair warning.
So you're prioritizing that clarity even over the goal of fighting crime.
It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about finding the right balance. We can't sacrifice fundamental rights for the sake of expediency. In the Johnson case, that really reinforces this need for consistency. If we struck down a similar clause in the ACCA, we have to hold 924 to the same standard. The government's argument for a conduct-specific approach, I get it, it sounds reasonable, but the language Congress used by its nature, it points us toward a categorical approach. We have to stick to what the law actually says, not what we wish it said.
So, despite the potential upheaval from revisiting old convictions, you think this ruling ultimately strengthens our legal system?
In the long run, yes. This puts the onus back on Congress. If they want to target conduct beyond crimes that inherently involve force, they need to be more specific. They need to spell it out clearly what constitutes a crime of violence. This ruling, it's a reminder that the law has to be clear and fair for everyone.
A really thoughtful perspective from our 10th chair. You know, this deep dive into Davis, it really shows us how the Supreme Court has to constantly walk this tightrope between upholding Congress's intentions and protecting individual rights. Understanding these subtle but important legal concepts like vagueness and categorical approaches, it really helps us grasp how our justice system works, the complexity of it all. And I think that's what we try to do here, shed some light on these significant Supreme Court decisions. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. We heard the dissent's concern about fighting violent crime, and the majority's focus on clarity in the law. How do we best balance those two goals? How should Congress define crime of violence in a way that's effective but also fair and constitutional? That's a question worth pondering as we move forward.